Everyone laughed at his snow trench home, calling it impractical and absurd. But when the freezing winds howled through the mountains and others shivered in their cabins, his home remained warm, warmer than anyone could have imagined. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if tales of survival and innovation like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode will reveal another story that's just as unbelievable. In the dead of winter, when the winds in the mountains had a biting ferocity that could freeze a man's bones in minutes, Henry O'Malley lay beneath thick firs, his eyes squinting into the cold twilight. His cabin, a marvel of design in its own right, stood on the edge of a forest in the isolated stretch of the Rockies. Most people would have called it a modest affair. But inside, Henry felt a warmth that defied all expectations. That warmth came not from a roaring fire, but from the very walls of his home, constructed not of logs, but of snow. It was the kind of home that made the seasoned trappers and prospectors around him laugh behind his back. They mocked it, called it a snow trench home, and couldn't imagine it standing against the harshest of winters. Yet Henry had spent months designing and constructing his home, learning from the methods of ancient peoples who had built shelters out of the very elements around them. He had studied the Inuit and the ancient snow dwellers of the highlands, adapting their techniques to the unforgiving conditions of the Rockies. His snow walls were built thick, layered with carefully compacted snow and reinforced with animal skins. The entrance was small, almost buried, but once inside, it was unlike any cabin in the wilderness. It was quiet, insulated, and above all, warm. While the others struggled to keep their fires burning in their log cabins, trying to ward off the biting cold with wood that often refused to stay lit, Henry's fire barely flickered, yet the heat it provided was more than enough. The snow trench home didn't just survive the cold, it thrived in it. The mockers had no idea just how much it would change their understanding of what it meant to survive the harshest of winters. As he lay there, his breath slow and steady, Henry's mind wandered back to the early days of planning, when he had first gathered the materials and ideas that would make this place not just a shelter, but a sanctuary. It hadn't been easy to convince others that this strange design could work. They thought him mad, perhaps even delusional, but in that moment, in the warmth of his snow-covered walls, Henry could only smile. The cold outside seemed far away, and the world beyond his shelter felt like another lifetime. The first snowfall had come late that year, blanketing the entire mountain in thick, unforgiving snow. For Henry, it was a welcome sight, a sign that his experiment was about to be tested. The others had all prepared for a brutal winter. They stocked their log cabins with firewood, sealed every crevice, and hoped their homes would hold up against the relentless cold. But Henry knew something they didn't. The secret to warmth didn't lie in the fire alone. The snow walls he had created were the true insulation. The snow had been compacted in layers, with each layer building on the next, creating an almost impenetrable barrier to the wind. Snow, he had learned from his research, was a natural insulator, and when packed properly, it held heat better than wood or stone. While the others worried about how much firewood they had, Henry knew that his greatest advantage was not in fire, but in the very structure of his home. Days turned into weeks, and the mountain storms came. The wind screamed through the trees, howling like a beast, trying to tear apart the world. The temperature plummeted, far colder than anything Henry had ever felt before, but inside his snow trench home, it was calm, peaceful, and surprisingly warm. The fire burned low, but the room felt as if it were wrapped in a constant, gentle embrace of heat. Meanwhile, outside, the others were struggling. The men who had laughed at Henry's design now found themselves chopping wood in the freezing cold, their cabins colder than ever. They cursed their fires, which seemed to burn down faster than they could feed them, and they cursed their construction methods, which were not built for such a relentless winter. As the days wore on and the cold tightened its grip on the land, they began to realize something. Henry O'Malley's snow trench home was no joke. It was a fortress against the cold. One morning, a messenger arrived at Henry's cabin, his face red and raw from the bitter wind. He was from the nearest town, where the others had set up camp for the season. "They're asking to see your place, Henry," the man said, his voice strained against the cold. "They want to know how you've managed to stay warm all this time." Henry smiled and nodded, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. It hadn't been about proving anyone wrong, he knew that, but seeing the curiosity in the messenger's eyes made it clear that they were beginning to understand the value of what he had built. The snow trench home, though ridiculed at first, had proven itself to be more than a mere shelter. It had become a new way of surviving the brutal wilderness, one that didn't rely on endless supplies of firewood or the fleeting warmth of a cabin that couldn't keep the cold out. As Henry stood and walked toward the door, his boots crunching in the thick snow, he realized this was just the beginning. The world might have laughed at his invention, but soon they would see that his snow trench home was more than a place to live. It was the future of surviving the wilderness. The first group to visit Henry's snow trench home arrived just after the first major storm of the season. Their boots crunched in the thick snow as they trudged toward the entrance, their faces drawn and weary from the cold. They had come to see for themselves what Henry's strange design had to offer, some out of curiosity, others out of desperation, but all of them hoping for some answer to the question that had been plaguing them since the snow began to fall. How had Henry O'Malley made it through the first few weeks of winter while they struggled to keep the fires burning? Henry greeted them at the entrance, a simple hole in the snow, and led them inside. The warmth inside the cabin hit them like a wave. The air, despite the bitter winds howling outside, was thick and pleasant, the heat coming from the fire at the center, but also from the very walls surrounding them. The air wasn't dry like in a traditional cabin. It was steady, holding a comforting warmth that didn't need constant tending. The fire barely needed to be fed, the walls absorbing heat during the day and slowly releasing it at night, ensuring the space stayed warm even as temperatures plummeted outside. One of the men, a burly trapper named Elias, looked around with wide eyes. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. This isn't possible, he muttered, rubbing his frozen hands together. "You built this out of snow?" Henry nodded, watching their faces as they took in the sight of the cozy interior, made even more inviting by the stark contrast to the frozen wilderness beyond the snow walls. "It's more than snow," Henry said simply. "It's all in the construction, the layering, the insulation. Snow's not the enemy of warmth, it's the way you use it." As Elias moved closer to the fire, feeling its warmth, another trapper named Jeb asked, "How long will it last? How do you keep it from melting?" Henry smiled at the question. It was the same one he had asked himself in the beginning. "It's all in the compaction," he replied. "The denser it is, the less likely it is to melt. The cold stays outside, and the heat stays in, just like the old ways, adapted for the Rockies." The visitors exchanged glances, unsure of whether to believe him. It was one thing to see it for themselves, but another to fully understand the simplicity and brilliance behind the design. Most of them had been relying on old-fashioned methods, log cabins, wood stoves, and firewood. It had worked for generations, but now, in the face of these relentless winters, they were questioning its effectiveness. Henry had offered them something different, something they had dismissed as foolishness only a few weeks ago. After a few moments of silence, Elias spoke up again, this time with a new respect in his voice. "You might be onto something here, Henry. We've got to admit this is working. You've got something that we don't." Henry's eyes met his, and for the first time since the mocking had begun, he felt the seed of validation begin to take root. Hadn't been about proving them wrong, but seeing the spark of understanding in their eyes filled him with a quiet pride. The others began to speak among themselves, murmuring about the long winters ahead and how Henry's snow trench design could save them from the harshest conditions. But Henry knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. They would need to test his design further to see if it could stand up to the full force of the mountain's winter. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The fire crackled, the snow fell softly outside, and for the first time, he wasn't the odd one out. He was the one with the answer. The winter had barely begun, but the mountains were already unleashing their fury. The snowstorms grew harsher, the wind howling as if trying to sweep away everything in its path. Henry's snow trench home stood firm, its walls solid and unyielding. Yet, this was only the beginning. The true test was still to come. He knew that no matter how much faith he had in his construction, nature had a way of proving even the best-laid plans wrong. Days turned into weeks, and the storms raged on. Henry watched as the snow piled higher and higher around his home, the cold creeping closer and closer, but inside the temperature remained steady, and the warmth from the fire never waned. It was holding up, but the real challenge would come when the temperature dropped further, when the snow reached the depth of the season's harshest days. Then, one fateful morning, the temperature plummeted beyond anything Henry had anticipated. The winds howled so fiercely that even the strongest trees groaned under the weight of the storm. The sky turned gray, and snow began to fall in thick, almost suffocating sheets, blanketing the land in a veil of white. Henry had prepared for the worst, but even his nerves tightened as the storm settled into a brutal, relentless rhythm. That evening, as the wind battered his home, Henry sat near the fire, his boots heavy from the deep snow outside. He stared into the flames, reflecting on how far he had come. It was a quiet victory in many ways. His cabin had withstood the first few weeks, but now he would face the ultimate test. The cabin was already a marvel in its own right, but if it could survive this storm, it would prove itself to be something far more valuable than just a shelter. The storm raged on, the wind screeching through the night like an animal caught in the wild. Henry listened to the sounds of nature's fury, but inside his snow trench home, all was calm. The heat from the fire lingered in the air, and he felt no chill seeping through the walls. For a moment he allowed himself to relax, to believe that perhaps he had truly done it. His home was more than just a refuge. It was an enduring testament to what ingenuity could accomplish. The next morning, the storm had finally passed. Henry ventured outside, his breath clouding in the frigid air. He dug his way through the snow to examine the outside of his home, running his hands over the compacted snow walls. To his surprise, the structure held firm. There were no cracks, no signs of melting or shifting. The snow had held its form, and the warmth from inside had kept the cabin safe from the brutal cold. It was then that Henry knew. He had succeeded. His snow trench home had survived its first true test. The others in the area might have doubted him, mocked his unconventional methods, but in the face of nature's unforgiving power, it was his home that stood strong, and as word of its success began to spread, more people would come to him, not to mock, but to learn. The snow trench home had not just proven its worth, it had changed the way people would think about survival in the mountains forever. The weeks following the storm passed in a quiet, almost surreal peace. While the mountains continued to wrestle with the unpredictable forces of nature, Henry's snow trench home remained a steady presence on the landscape. The winds howled and the snow piled higher, but inside it was always warm, comfortable, and secure. Word about Henry's design had spread, first among the local trappers, then across the neighboring settlements. One morning, as Henry was tending the fire and preparing to venture out into the wilderness to check his traps, he saw a figure approaching in the distance. It was Elias, the burly trapper, who had visited Henry's cabin weeks before with a group of skeptics. This time Elias was alone, and his face was set in a serious expression. "Morning, Henry," Elias called out as he approached, his voice carrying above the wind. Henry gave a short nod. "What brings you out here?" "I need your help," Elias said, stepping closer and glancing at the snow trench home. "I've been talking to the others about your place. They're asking how you built it, what makes it so damn warm. Seems like everyone's trying to figure out how to survive this winter, and your idea is the only one that's really working. They're curious. Hell, they're desperate." Henry raised an eyebrow. He had expected some kind of reaction, but the seriousness in Elias's voice caught him off guard. "You're asking me to teach them?" he asked. Elias nodded. "Not just teach them. Help us build our own homes. We've got nothing left to lose, Henry. If your snow trench is the answer, then maybe we can all survive this winter. We can't keep running from the cold. We've got families, and we're running out of firewood." Henry paused, taking in the gravity of the request. The pressure of the mountain wilderness, of survival itself, weighed heavily on everyone's shoulders. He had always kept his methods to himself, not wanting to be seen as an outsider or an oddity. But now, with the stakes this high, he couldn't afford to be selfish. If he could share the knowledge that had saved him, it could save them all. "All right," Henry said after a moment's reflection. "I'll help you. But it's not just about building a shelter. It's about understanding how the snow works, how to use what's around you. We'll need to do it right, or it won't stand up to another storm." Elias's face broke into a wide grin, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Henry. You don't know what this means." Over the next few days, word spread quickly. More and more men, and even a few families, arrived at Henry's cabin, eager to learn how to build their own snow trench homes. It was no longer just a curiosity. It was a matter of survival. Henry guided them through the process, showing them how to gather the right kind of snow, how to pack it carefully to create solid walls that could withstand the wind. He showed them how to layer the snow and seal the cracks, how to ensure that each home would be insulated against the cold. The work was slow and arduous, but every step they took felt like progress, a shared effort to survive the season's worst. As the men worked, Henry felt a sense of pride swelling in his chest. The design he had once kept to himself was now becoming a lifeline for others. The mockery that had once stung was slowly being replaced with gratitude and respect. The snow trench home wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to all of them. The first true test of Henry's teachings came sooner than expected. The snow had fallen heavier than ever, and with it, a fierce cold settled in. The wind howled like a living thing, battering the land, and the temperatures dropped so low that even seasoned mountain men were feeling the sting. It was the kind of weather that could break a man, break him, or make him question his place in the wilds forever. One evening, as Henry sat inside his snow trench home, watching the flames crackle in the fire pit, he heard the unmistakable crunch of boots in the snow outside. He rose, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle, but the figure in the doorway was familiar. Elias, looking pale and exhausted. "Elias? What's happened?" Henry asked, moving to greet him. Elias stepped inside, shaking the snow from his thick coat. His eyes were wide with fear. "It's bad, Henry. The others, they're losing the fight. The cold's too much. Their cabins, they're not holding up. There's too much snow, too much wind. It's breaking them down." Henry's heart sank as he listened. He had known the storm was coming, but hearing the desperation in Elias's voice made it all too real. The others had tried to build their own homes, but they hadn't fully grasped the intricacies of what made Henry's design work. Their homes were collapsing under the weight of the snow, and without the proper insulation and structure, the cold was creeping in just as it had in the past. "I've got to go back," Elias continued, his voice urgent. "There's a group of families. They're huddled together trying to survive. If we don't act fast, we'll lose them." Henry stood still for a moment, his mind racing. He knew the stakes now. This wasn't just about proving his design, it was about saving lives. "All right," Henry said, his voice steady. "I'll help, but we need to move fast. There's no time to waste." They gathered what supplies they could. Extra animal furs, tools, and the knowledge Henry had shared with the others. Together, they set off into the storm, their path obscured by the thick snow. The wind cut through the night, but Henry felt a sense of determination he hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about a single man's survival anymore, it was about the survival of everyone around him. As they reached the other cabins, Henry could see the dire condition they were in. Some had collapsed completely, while others were barely standing against the battering storm. The people inside were huddled close, trying to stay warm, but the air was frigid. The desperation in their eyes told the full story. Henry wasted no time. He began instructing Elias and the others on how to reinforce the cabins using the techniques he had perfected, adding layers of snow insulation, reinforcing the weak spots, and sealing every crack. The work was hard, and the cold bit at their skin. But as the night passed, Henry could see the transformation taking place. The cabins, once doomed to fail, now stood stronger, warmer. By the time the storm subsided, the cabins were holding up. The wind still howled, but the families inside were safe, their warmth protected by the snow trench design that Henry had crafted. The turning point had come. The test had been passed. And for the first time, Henry knew beyond a shadow of a doubt. The snow trench home was no longer just a clever idea. It was a lifeline, one that would change the way people survived in the wilderness forever. The storm had passed, but its effects would be felt for much longer than anyone anticipated. In the days that followed, the people who had once scoffed at Henry's snow trench home now began to realize its potential. The survivors of the harsh winter began to speak of it, what it had saved them from, how it had shielded them from nature's wrath when their own homes had failed. The word spread like wildfire through the mountain settlements, a quiet whisper at first, then a roar. Henry's invention wasn't just an oddity anymore, it was becoming a symbol of survival. Elias had returned to his camp after the storm, and soon after, a dozen men arrived at Henry's cabin, each of them carrying the same message. They had tried to build their own snow trench homes, but they needed more instruction. The desperation that had colored their voices earlier was now replaced by something else, respect and a kind of quiet awe. Henry had become a beacon of hope, a man whose unconventional methods had saved not only his life, but the lives of many others. Henry was humbled, but he couldn't help feeling a quiet satisfaction. As more people came to seek his guidance, he saw how his ideas were beginning to take root in the community. The men who had laughed at him before now sought his counsel, asking for advice on how to build their own homes, how to protect their families from the relentless cold. It was more than just about shelter. It was about learning a new way of thinking, a new way of survival. The work was exhausting, but Henry felt a deep sense of purpose. With each snow trench home built, with each new layer of snow carefully packed and sealed, he saw the community transform. Where once there had been skepticism, now there was collaboration. The men who had once viewed each other as rivals were now working side by side, sharing materials, learning new skills, and helping one another survive. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the cabins that had once been barely functional in the face of winter's fury became havens of warmth and security. The walls of snow stood firm, and the fire in each cabin burned steadily. The temperature outside remained brutal, but inside life was different. Families gathered around their hearths, children played in the safety of their homes, and the men who had once thought they could never endure the cold now thrived in their snow trench homes. Henry continued to teach, always humble, always careful in his explanations. He knew that what he had started was more than just a trend. It was a fundamental shift in how they would live. The snow trench homes weren't just shelters. They were a new way of understanding the environment. They used what nature gave them, shaping it into something that protected them from the elements, something that allowed them to survive in a harsh and unforgiving wilderness. As the snow continued to fall, Henry found himself at the center of a quiet revolution. People came from far and wide, drawn not only by the promise of warmth, but by the sense of community that had blossomed around the snow trench homes. He was no longer the outcast, the eccentric man who had built a strange home in the snow. He was a teacher, a leader in a community that was learning to survive, and perhaps to thrive, together. It had been months since the storm, and the mountain landscape had transformed. The once barren, lifeless scene was now dotted with the snow trench homes Henry had taught others to build. The first snows of the next winter had already begun to fall, but the people no longer feared what the season would bring. Their homes were sturdy, built to withstand even the harshest of conditions. It was clear now that the snow trench homes were more than just an emergency solution. They were the future of survival in the wilderness. Henry stood outside his own snow trench home, watching the snowflakes swirl in the early morning light. It was a peaceful moment, but one that carried the weight of the journey he had been on. He had started out as a man with a vision, a single person trying to make it through a brutal winter. But now, looking at the cabins that dotted the land, he saw something more. He saw a community transformed, a group of people who had come together not only to survive, but to build a new way of life. The sound of footsteps in the snow broke his reverie. He turned to see Elias walking toward him, his face lined with the wear of a hard winter, but his expression bright with pride. "It's working, Henry," Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "We're surviving. Hell, we're thriving. And it's all because of you." Henry smiled but said nothing. The work wasn't done, not by a long shot. But he knew that this moment was the culmination of everything he had worked for. The cabins were no longer just a temporary solution. They were becoming permanent fixtures in the landscape, part of the fabric of the wilderness. The men and families who had built them now saw their homes not as just protection from the elements, but as symbols of resilience, of ingenuity, and of community. In the months that followed, more and more settlers and trappers arrived, drawn by the stories of the snow trench homes. Some came to learn, some came to seek shelter, and others came simply to witness the innovation firsthand. Henry, who had once kept to himself, now found himself at the center of a movement, one that was changing the way people lived in the wilderness. As the years passed, the legacy of the snow trench home endured. It became known far and wide as a beacon of survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. And though Henry never sought fame or recognition, his name became synonymous with the invention that had saved countless lives. More than just a shelter, the snow trench home was a testament to the power of one person's vision and to the community that had rallied around it. Henry's home, the place that had once been laughed at and ridiculed, had become a symbol of what could be accomplished when people came together to face the unknown. His legacy, built of snow, fur, and the sweat of those who had worked beside him, would endure long after he was gone. The years had softened the harshness of the mountain winters, but the bond that had been forged in the snow remained strong. Henry's snow trench homes had become more than a symbol of survival. They were a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit and to the power of innovation when pushed to its limits. The community that had grown around them continued to thrive, but Henry knew that the time was coming for him to move on. One crisp autumn day, as the mountains began to show the first hints of winter's approach, Henry stood outside his snow trench home, looking over the land that had been his sanctuary for so long. The sound of laughter and hammering echoed in the distance as others worked to reinforce their homes, preparing for another winter. It was a quiet day, but one that held the weight of a decision Henry had been contemplating for months. His work was done here, his legacy had been built, and it was time for the next chapter of his life to begin. Elias, who had been by Henry's side through it all, approached him with a hesitant smile. "You planning on staying here, Henry?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes searching. Henry smiled and shook his head. "No, Elias. My time here is done. The community is strong now. It's time for me to move on." Elias didn't protest, but there was a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "I suppose that's how it goes. You've done more for us than we could ever repay. You showed us how to survive, how to build a life here." Henry placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You've all done the hard part. I just showed you the way. The future of these homes is in your hands now. It's time for me to pass the torch." As Elias walked away, Henry stood there for a long moment, taking in the sight of the snow trench homes scattered across the landscape. His work would live on, not through any monument or stone carving, but through the homes that had saved lives and brought a community together. Henry had shown them how to build with what the land provided, how to survive not just the winters, but life itself. The torch had been passed, and Henry knew he had left a lasting impact, one that would be felt long after he was gone. The years came and went, and Henry's presence in the mountains faded like the final remnants of a storm. He moved on, settling in a small town far from the wilderness where the harsh winters no longer held sway over his life. But the legacy of his snow trench homes, the structures that had once been laughed at, lived on. Generations came and went, and the snow trench homes remained, standing firm against the changing world. The settlers who had once looked at Henry as an eccentric now saw him as a visionary. Over time, the homes spread beyond the mountains. As the fur trade dwindled and settlers began to push further west, Henry's homes, now known as O'Malley cabins, became synonymous with survival in harsh climates. Even though Henry never sought fame or recognition, the stories of his ingenuity lived on in the cabins he had helped build. The homes were no longer just structures of survival. They were symbols of the strength of human perseverance and adaptability. They had become a refuge for many who needed protection from the elements, and a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, innovation and determination could create something lasting. As he sat by the fire in his new home, many years later, Henry often thought back to the mountain winters, to the quiet mornings when the snow would fall and the wind would howl. He had started out as a man with a vision, trying to build a home that could withstand nature's worst. But in the end, what he had built was so much more. He had built a future. And as the snow began to fall once again, Henry knew that his legacy was carved into the very fabric of the land, woven into the walls of the homes that had weathered the storms, the cold, and the test of time. The snow trench home, built from snow, from determination, and from the will to survive, had become a cornerstone of the wilderness itself. And in that quiet legacy, Henry O'Malley had left his mark on the world, one that would never be erased.